Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be with you tonight. I want to introduce you to one of our nation's overlooked founding fathers, John Laurance. My first reaction when I ran across him researching another book was, John who? And I suspect your first reaction was pretty much the same. John who? Well, tonight's lecture will tell you not only John who he is, but why does he matter? This is John Laurance. It's about a 1800 oil painting that hangs in the New York Historical Society of New York Senator John Laurance. He was born in Cornwall, England, about 1750, and in his 17th year came to the United States. His birth name was not Laurance, but rather the conventional Laurance, Law. When he got to the United States and became one of the first immigrants ever to crash the New York bar was highly inbred, and he must have been quite gifted in order to crack the bar. He then changed the spelling of his name to the Lau because there was another John Laurance with the W who was a lawyer in New York and another one in New Jersey. Before the war, he fell in love with the daughter of one of the rascally rebels in the state of New York, and fell in with the Patriots and the Sons of the American Revolution, and donned a uniform in 1775 as a soldier and went to the Battle of Quebec. Came home. In a year, his father-in-law had become a general in Washington's army, and Laurance was no longer a captain. He became a lieutenant colonel and George Washington's Judge Advocate General for 5 years in the war. After the war, his law practice in New York boomed, and he became a legislator in both houses of the New York legislature, in the Continental Congress, in the first Federal Congress, and in the United States Senate. He was appointed the District Judge of New York by George Washington toward the end of his term, and he set breakthrough law in matters of extradition. And I'll touch more on all of these points as we go along. He was also a Mason. Now, I am not a Mason, and my research on Laurance as a Mason took place in the Robert Livingston Library in New York. And there are several volumes there that make it clear that it's the John Laurance we're talking about, who was in fact Washington's secretary, and before that, at a young age, Secretary of St. John's No. 2, junior warden, and then was among those who, when the revolution broke out, absconded with the warrant. Now, I don't believe the Laurance had the warrant, but he was one of the group that left. After the war, he came back and was named Master of the Lodge. He became Joint Secretary of the New York Grand Lodge that year when Robert R. Livingston was in fact the Grand Master. And in 1801, he was the one that mastered the ceremony that transitioned Robert Livingston out of the Grand Master position for New York. But there's far more to Laurance than that. As George Washington's Judge Advocate General, he became the father of the U.S. Army Judge Advocate Corps. It was Laurance who put the department into effect, and it was Laurance who set precedent for its most important court-martial cases. He was also Alexander Hamilton's 30-year friend, legislative champion of Hamilton's very aggressive financial agenda in Congress, and his investment partner. Now, Hamilton could run the nation's finances, but he was very sloppy on his own, and he several times had to borrow cash from Laurance in order to pay his bills. They bought land together in upstate New York as speculators. They went to church together. And in fact, Laurance was one of the 8 men who carried Alexander's coffin to ground at Trinity Church in Manhattan. Laurance was the only foreign-born citizen ever to rise within 2 heartbeats of the United States presidency. In the Senate, he was elected Senate President Pro Tem in 1798. And at that time, the line of succession was that the Senate President Pro Tempore was right behind Vice President. So if something happened to President Adams and Vice President Jefferson, John Laurance would have become the third president of the United States. Now that was changed in 1886, where the Secretary of State became the backup to the vice president. And then in 1947, it's the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Laurance also provides this fresh lens on four aspects of our country's founding that's really worth going a little deeper on. And this is what makes the case for why should we care about John Laurance. First of all, he makes us question the founding father myth as if there were 7 or 8 founding fathers who created the country. He makes the case there were many, many more. As an immigrant, he defined what is an American citizen for the first time. He set the stage for US Army military justice as the wartime Judge Advocate General in George Washington's Army. And then last, he provides a new lens on the whole Federalist era, not only as Alexander Hamilton's champion in Congress, but as a Federalist who began to question much of Federalist ideology. So let's take each one of these one by one. Great man theory. When in doubt in American politics, left, right, or center, deploy the founding fathers. That's what Jill Lepore wrote. Jill has written extensively on American politics and is a historian at Harvard University. Great man theory is the fallback for the legend of the United States. But behind that, and here are the great men, you may have seen this last summer, Time magazine ran a special issue on founding fathers. They named the 7, the Magnificent 7, who we've in legend enthroned as the American visionaries who created our nation. But neither Washington, nor Jefferson, nor Madison, nor Franklin, nor Hamilton ever referred to themselves or the others as a founding father. John Adams said, "Don't call me father of his country or founder of the republic. These titles belong to no man, but the American people in general." John Jay, one of the Magnificent 7, said toward the end of his career, a great many of people in those days were not at all what they seemed, nor what they are generally believed to have been. And Benjamin Rush, who knew all of the Magnificent 7, and in fact signed the Declaration of Independence, wrote, "I shall continue to believe that great men are a lie." So how did this whole myth of founding fathers begin then, if it wasn't from the fathers themselves? Well, it began in 1895 in an issue of Sunset magazine, and President Harding used the phrase to campaign for the office in a number of magazine articles, and he liked it so much, he used it in his keynote speech at the 1916 National Republican Convention. But the real myth began in 1941 with Kenneth Umbreth's book, Men Who Shaped Our Tradition. He came up with 6, all incidentally from Massachusetts and Virginia. Building on that was Richard B. Morris, a New York historian, whose classic book, 7 Who Shaped Our Destiny, defined the 7 founding fathers we know today. And he added John Jay as a New Yorker to the list and got rid of one of the Adams family. So these are the 7 that have come down in legend as the founding fathers. But in reality, the founders were not 7 men. The founders were 14,000 officers of George Washington's Continental Army, 343 members of Continental and Confederated Congress, 56 signers of the Declaration, 55 framers of the Constitution, 672 men who ratified it at the state level, and 94 members of the first federal Congress who actually were an extension of the Constitutional Convention in putting the paper Constitution into action. Now, John Laurance was 4 of those 6. So if anybody has the resume to be included in the founding generation, it's John Laurance. And I'll leave it with Joseph Ellis, who wrote the classic Pulitzer winner, Founding Brothers. His point of view is there weren't 7 founding fathers, there was a founding generation. And my point of view is that John Laurance was one of them. So much for the founding father myth. Laurance was not born in the United States. So it makes the question arise, how did he become a citizen? And what exactly is a citizen? What can we learn about American citizenship from John Laurance? Now, Laurance was born in Cornwall, but had he arrived in the United States after 1740, and he was a Protestant, and he'd been there for at least 7 years, he could have been then claimed one of His Majesty's natural-born subjects, and therefore John Laurance was a British subject when he arrived in America. Now, Parliament in 1773 forbid naturalization of aliens in the colonies. That means if Laurance had arrived in 1773, he could not have become a naturalized citizen. And this was one of the issues that led to the Declaration of Independence, who absolved subjects of allegiance to King George. Why? King George endeavored to prevent the population of the United States by obstructing laws for naturalization of foreigners. From the very beginning, the people who owned land in the colonies needed immigrant foreigners to sell that land and grow it. And when Parliament forbid it, that was one more straw in the wind for revolution. Then came the Constitution in 1789, which Laurance helped put into effect in the first Federal Congress, which says you're a citizen if you're natural born or a citizen of the United States at the time. Well, Laurance was a citizen of the time, even though he wasn't naturally born in the United States. So he was then a United States citizen. The Constitution went on to direct Congress to establish uniform rules of naturalization, and Laurance was on the committee that did that. The Naturalization Act of 1790, which Laurance was on, declared that any alien, as long as they were a free white person, which did cut down the candidates quite dramatically. And if they were there for 2 years, one state in the year, and they had references of good character and took an oath, they became a United States citizen. Now, the South Carolina Congress said what was really going on here was to let foreigners in on easy term so they can hold land. Because if they buy land, they will become an American citizen because they have skin in the game. And so it was. Now, Federalists said, let's do this. Open America as an asylum to those who suffer and populate the country with ingenious and valuable workmen. Robert R. Livingston, who was a Republican after leaving the Federalist ranks, said the Constitution expressly excludes distinction between citizen and alien. Alien friends residing among us are entitled to protection of our laws. So right from the beginning, Laurance, like other immigrants coming to the country, were welcomed because they would become land buyers and they would grow into skin in the game American citizens. Then ethnicity started sticking its head into matters. During the Alien Sedition laws, residency was extended to 14 years, and then the Dred Scott case said, if you were a Negro, you were not a person, and if you were not a person, you could not be a United States citizen. After the Civil War came the 14th Amendment, which said all persons born or naturalized in the US are citizens. That meant Blacks. Then Congress swung back to ethnicity again in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. If you were Chinese born, you could not only not enter the country, but you couldn't become a citizen. The Supreme Court then took on a case in 1898 that said, no, if you're an Asian child born in America, you are a citizen. Then in 1924, we created ethnic quotas, no Asians though, and the Border Patrol. And then finally, in 1924, American Indians who were born here could become citizens. FDR opened the door to values instead of ethnicity in 1943. Americanism is a matter of the mind and heart, not race or ancestry. Asians at last in 1952 could become citizens. The quota system was abolished in 1965, and the Simpson-Mazzoli Act granted amnesty to more than 3,000 illegals in 1986. If Laurance were alive in 1986, he would have cheered for that because that's how he got in. Well, we talked about the myth and Laurance's lens on that in immigration, citizenship. Let's talk about US Army military justice. Laurance was the Continental Army Judge Advocate General from 1777 to 1782. He was Washington and Valley Forge's courtroom Baron von Steuben. Now, the Baron has been given credit for bringing discipline to George Washington's army, but he didn't arrive until February of 1778, and his drills didn't begin until March. Laurance, from December of 77 through March, conducted court-martials as the primary form of disciplining George Washington's army. He got rid out of 1 of 20 of Washington's officer corps at Valley Forge because they didn't have the right stuff to meet the general's standards. He formed the Judge Advocate Department with 3 departments, one in the north, one of the main army, and one in the south, and he staffed it. He prosecuted at the court-martial of Generals Charles Lee, Arthur St. Clair, Benedict Arnold, and he prosecuted British Major John Andre, who was Arnold's go-between for treason. He prosecuted him to the gallows. After the Revolution, it was Laurance who chaired the committee who amended the Articles of War 1786 that pretty much stayed in place until the Civil War. Laurance, of course, belongs in our history books for more than just being the father of the Judge Advocate Corps. He was a key player in the Federalist Era, the Federalist Era of 1787 to 1800 that progressed from Continental Congress to the Constitution, to the ratification of the Constitution, to the Revolution of 1800, in which Federalists were thrown out and replaced by Jeffersonian Republicans. Laurance's legacy in the Federalist Era is large and deep, and he really deserves to be remembered as one of the key players. He was a collaborative man, not a large ego, not the kind who demanded the attention, but he was always the one who got the job done in the back room. In the first Federal Congress, in the Federal District Court of New York, and in the Senate, as an ally of President Adams as quasi-war with France erupted. And he was the one, both in the House and in the Senate, who brought to bear the first bankruptcy laws in the United States of America. Let's take these one by one. The first Federal Congress. The first Federal Congress went into effect in 1789 through 1791. During that period, Laurance was on 38 different committees. He spoke for a strong executive and a robust judiciary as the Congress was trying to translate the Constitution into a real government. Remember, this Congress, when they came to be, all they had was the Constitution. They had no money. Washington had not taken office yet as the first president. There were no taxes in place. There was no standing army, no standing navy. All there was a piece of paper called the Constitution, and the first Federal Congress then put it into the flesh and blood of a real government. James Madison had a tight constructionist approach to doing all of this. He thought the federal government should be constrained to what was articulated specifically by the Constitution. Most Federalists, however, particularly Hamilton and Laurance, thought a strong executive and a robust judiciary would pave the way for a capitalist society in which commerce would build us into one of the world's powers. And they were called loose constructionists. And they fought against Madison at virtually every turn, because Laurance was the man on the floor in Congress who drove Alexander Hamilton's financial agenda. Hamilton never set foot in Congress, yet it's Hamilton who gets credit for the National Bank, the funding of the national debt, and the trade-off of bonds and other forms of debt to actually pay off the Revolutionary War debt. But it was Laurance on the floor of Congress who argued all of Hamilton's programs into law. Here are some of the things Laurance was in the forefront in the first Federal Congress. The Impost Act and Collection Act. This created tax base to actually fund the government. Then he championed the bill to refinance the entire national debt at par. That meant $1 spent in 1777 was paid back with a full dollar. That created issues with Madison in the South, who'd already paid off many of their debts in Virginia and wanted to see the debt discounted. Hamilton and Laurance created a sinking fund from postal revenues, which created the money to pay off the debt and help support the value of the American bonds. He funded federal expenses with a whiskey tax, which again irritated the Southerners because so many people made their spending money out of whiskey. He helped bring the bill to establish a national mint in Philadelphia and a bill to establish a national bank. All of these, John Laurance was the Federalist frontman on the floor of Congress to get legislation passed. Another part of his legacy is the district judge for the Federal District of New York. In 1795, he ruled that a French officer who jumped ship did not have to be extradited at the word of the state governments. He ruled that extradition was a judicial process and did not even fall under the hands of the Secretary of State or the Attorney General of the United States, John Randolph, at the time. The French were upset. They went to John Randolph, who was then the Attorney General of the United States, and convinced Randolph to bring suit against who? John Laurance, the judge who ruled against extraditing the French officer. Well, the argument before the Supreme Court was not even completed before the justices agreed that Lawrence's decision was valid and upheld, and they affirmed his decision not to extradite the French officer, and that it was the judicial branch, not the executive branch, that determined extradition. John Laurance was a quasi-war ally of President Adams during the war with France. I call it war because although it was quasi-war, our ships were fighting at sea and we were preparing for invasion. At that point in time, the Senate of the United States was actually running foreign policy, not the president. The Senate had even decided to declare war whether the president wanted to or not, but the vote didn't pass both houses of Congress as required. As John Adams' wartime Senate ally, co-chairing the Senate Committee for Arms and the Navy, Lawrence's committee helped bring 6 new Navy yards into being. They gave sail to 6 big frigates, including Constitution. They created the Marine Corps. They authorized 12 small frigates and more than 20 privateers. They created the Department of the Navy, and they established and funded harbor fortifications for defending the country. This was over the objection of the Jeffersonian Republicans, who wanted none of that because fighting France was not on their agenda. The final part of Lawrence's Federalist legacy really comes down to the bankruptcy area. At that time, English common law protected creditors. Before the Revolution, we were governed by English law and English common law. And after the Revolution, amazingly, there were really no changes in bankruptcy law, either in the Constitution or in any of the states. At that time, if you were bankrupt, you went to jail. All the common law protected were creditors. If you were the borrower, you had essentially no protection. And a lot of people, including Supreme Court Justice James Harrison at that time, or James Wilson, excuse me, were bankrupt and were on their way to jail. In fact, a Supreme Court justice fled to North Carolina to avoid the marshals coming to throw him in jail for bankruptcy. But what matters came to the head, what brought matters to the head in American bankruptcy was the Panic of 1792, when a lot of big names became bankrupt because they had invested in speculative land. One of those names, in fact, was James Greenleaf, who was John Lawrence's brother-in-law. So Laurance was on the committee in the House in 1791 and 1792 to draft bankruptcy law that could protect the borrower as well as the creditor. They never came up with a law. Congress moved to Philadelphia, and all the discussions in progress then adjourned. And when they started from scratch in Philadelphia, they couldn't get together a real Bankruptcy Act. It was not until the year 1800, when Laurance was in the Senate as New York's senior senator, that the House created a bankruptcy law and sent it to the Senate. Laurance chaired the committee in the Senate that reviewed and altered the law and brought it into being. Now, the Bankruptcy Act of 1800 not only enabled Laurance to get his son-in-law out of jail, and a lot of other important people like Robert Morris, who was the financier of the revolution. But the Bankruptcy Act of 1800 actually gave protection to borrowers instead of creditors. What it did was allowed a judge to proclaim a person bankrupt and appoint a commissioner to oversee the estate of the bankrupt individual. So instead of going to jail, the individual worked with the commissioner to work with the creditors to forgive part of the debt and pay off the other part over time. However, 2/3 of the creditor debt had to be willingly forgiven before the borrower went scot-free under the Bankruptcy Act of 1800. So it was still possible to go to jail. What happened, however, though, was money spoke, and well-heeled men who had hidden money found a way to negotiate their way out of their debts, where impoverished men who had no connections and no money could end up in jail anyway. And many of those impoverished men were not Federalists, they were Republicans. And so the Jeffersonians trashed the Bankruptcy Act of 1800 3 years after taking office. Well, along comes the election of 1800. Now remember, John Laurance has been a staunch Federalist before the war, during the war, during the ratification of the Constitution, in the first Federal Congress, through the Federalist era of George Washington's presidency and the Adams presidency, and then as a sitting United States Senator from New York in 1800 as the most divisive election of our country's history rolls around. Federalist John Adams looking for a second term, Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson looking to change the way the United States was run. Instead of Federalists and Northern manufacturers and banks, it was going to be agricultural people who didn't borrow. It was a train wreck for the Federalist Party. First of all, George Washington, who was the figurehead of the party in reality, died in December of 1799, and there was no one who could take his place. The country was seething with change. We were a nation of farmers, tiring of a government that favored cities, manufacturers, banks, speculators, England, and a standing army and navy. The Jeffersonian Republicans were against all of these. There was also hangover from the Alien and Sedition Act, where people who were too French in their behavior could be denied entry to the country. They could be sued for sedition. And in fact, many of the leading Republican newspapers were in court being accused of sedition against their country for publishing what they thought was the news. Then Alexander Hamilton split the Federalist Party in half. He sent out a circular letter that the press got a hold of that basically decried Adams as unfit for office. Now, Adams and Washington never hit it off. Adams confided that he thought that Hamilton was nothing but a half-breed immigrant bastard. And Hamilton turned called Adams demented and not really there, and wondered why Adams spent almost half his term at his farm in Massachusetts rather than in Philadelphia. So Adams fired half of his cabinet, which were Hamiltonian men, and he slashes the army that had been created for the quasi-war with France. Who was the general of that army? Well, after Washington died, it was Hamilton, who had grand plans for the army for himself and for taking it into South America on a massive land grab against the Spanish, who were weak at that time, as we and our British allies were strong. So for all of those reasons, the Federalist Party was divided and near collapse. Now, what was Laurance to do? He'd already begun questioning Federalist ideology and favoring some of the Jeffersonian thought, not enough to leave the party, but he found himself with four options at that time. After a career as a Federalist, he could either support Alexander Hamilton and the High Federalists. These were the guys who wanted to stay linked to England, fund the banks, keep an army, and fund manufacturing. Or he could support the sitting president, John Adams, who was his good friend. In fact, it was Adams who approved Laurance as George Washington's Judge Advocate General way back in 1777 in Congress. And it was Adams who had approved many of the programs that Laurance and Hamilton had authored in Congress. Or he could go over to the Republican Party. Robert R. Livingston had already done so, and so had another group of major Federalists. So what was he going to do? Support Hamilton, support Adams, go over to the Republicans, or wash hands of politics altogether? All of these were lose-lose propositions. To complicate matters, the very first day polls opened in the state of New York for presidential voting, Laurance's wife, his second wife, who at the time they were married was probably Philadelphia's most desirable high society widow, she died, passed away in their New York townhouse. Grief-stricken, Laurance attended to his wife's funeral and bowed out of the election of 1800 altogether. The consequences were severe. In his final years, he turned to be a Federalist Party pariah. He had abandoned the party in their greatest hour of need. He died in November of 1810 at the age of 60, and when he went to ground, his name went to ground because his only son, John, never married and never had any children. And his estate was divided up between John and the 6 daughters that he had from his 2 wives and the 3 stepdaughters that he inherited with his second wife. Couldn't you imagine that? 9 daughters. His estate, because he was one of New York's most successful land speculators, his estate filled 140 ledger-sized pages in New York land records. So many pages because rather than so many speculators who flipped their land, he subdivided it, developed it, then sold or leased to various small landowners so that page after page of his transaction had to be settled in order to settle his estate. It's an estate that today would be worth some $20 million. He never got to enjoy it because he was tight-fisted and kept all of his money and his returns going back into buying more land. So if you believe that America's founding legacy is not just a handful of iconic fathers, but rather the lasting rule of law, that it's the lasting rule of law under the Constitution that is our real founding legacy, you really have to include John Laurance because his whole life was in the law. Before the Revolution, during the Revolution, after the Revolution, in Congress, in the Senate, and as a federal district judge. Well, I've introduced you to John Laurance and why he deserves to be included in the narrative of our country's founding. Your first question may be, well, why wasn't he? Why have I never heard of him? The fact is, he never really had one of those signature moments. If it were Laurance, instead of Alexander Hamilton, that was gunned down across the Hudson River by Aaron Burr, we would remember Laurance. But Laurance was a guy who was a collaborative legislator and not ever in the center stage role. And so we don't know his name. Well, that's John Laurance, immigrant founding father America never knew. Now you know him. If you have questions, Alex will be very happy to gather them and pass them on back to me.